So what Metis does cleverly is it takes this idea of ESG risk management, breaks it down into five distinct modules, and then enables you to sort of click through and make all of that happen without the cost, without the time.
Marc, thank you so much for being here.
Antoine, a pleasure. Good to see you.
Marc, you're the co-founder of Metis ESG. I guess the first question that comes to mind, can you define ESG?
Oh my God, that is not the way I thought we would start. ESG is a paradigm or a way of looking at sustainability, right? And I think a lot of people get the terms really confused, right? What is sustainability? What's ESG? What's CSR? They all just meld into each other. And really, I think it's important to simplify sustainability to its true core. And that's the idea of making do with the resources that you have right now, utilizing them in such a way that those resources continue to exist in the future, right? And those resources can be anything. And that's why it's really helpful to have paradigms or different ways of looking at sustainability. ESG happens to be the framework that a lot of people think makes a lot of sense. E is for environmental, S is for social, and G is for governance. And I think it's a good place to start. You know what? You're right. It is a good place to start.
Yeah, Marc, I guess the follow-up here would be which part of ESG are you most focused on? Because when I did my research, I mean, it's a very broad term. It can cover so many different
Yes.
things. Is there a specific aspect of it? Because you really talked about sustainability here, about having resources for generations. But there's the social aspect, there's a human aspect. Is
Yeah.
that also something that you take into consideration, or is it purely about the resources?
No, I'm happy to answer that question. I think there's two ways to go about this. One is to tell you sort of my journey through sustainability, and another is to tell you what the product does. And I think it's probably best to weave them in together. Look, my background is in economics and political science, with a focus on social development specifically. That's what I thought would be the coolest thing to work on. How is it that we can ensure that people around the world are living slightly better lives? Or at least not terrible life, right? And coming out of university, you're often, wide-eyed. You're looking forward to a future that doesn't necessarily exist, and it's really hard to land a job in that field right off the bat. And so I found myself doing consulting. And in consulting, I started off doing things like political risk analysis, looking at due diligence, business intelligence, investigations of fraud and corruption. And then I got lucky. There's a lucky break. The firm that I worked for started a sustainability focused practice that focused on the social risk specifically. And what that meant in the context of this region here in the Middle East was to focus on human rights and to focus on labor rights. So, how is it that you go about ensuring that companies in their operations, in their constructions of assets, in their maintenance and in their operation of said assets are not abusing the rights of those who are making all of that possible. And so it was really my focus on figuring out what the appropriate standards were. What is it that you should be looking to do? How is it that you build an appropriate monitoring program? How is it that you staff and upskill people to continue to conduct that audit work and that monitoring work? And then to sustain that performance over time in such a way that you are upskilling the entities that you are assessing. It's not just about scoring them, it's about or assigning them a risk rating. Rather, it's about improving their performance, giving them the tools that they require. So the sort of beginnings of my focus on sustainability was very much in that social area. And it's over time that I started to see things in the wider context of sustainability, recognizing that, hey, everyone could, live better lives, but if they're living those better lives in a terrible environment where we cannot breathe, that's problematic too. And that you can't achieve that improved environment and improved social standing unless you have appropriate governance in place. And that's how ESG sort of comes together. Now, the way Metis approaches this is a little bit different. It's by taking this idea of compliance, of appropriate governance, of understanding the regulations and the actual performance, and measuring it and looking at it from a risk perspective. For you as a client utilizing Metis, the question is, how is my supply chain's performance on sustainability impacting my operations? If you are an entity with a portfolio rather than a supply chain, it's the same thing. How is their performance, my portfolio entity's performance on sustainability, affecting their performance, their ability to repay me? And what you'll come to see is that sustainability is a wonderful little leading indicator. It's the sort of thing where you will rarely come across companies that do well on sustainability, but do poorly everywhere else leading up to it. And so it can be often seen as a good leading indicator. And that's the general gist of it. It's how to view sustainability from a risk lens to protect yourself from reputational harm, from operational harm, from legal troubles, and ensuring that you provide the necessary support to reap the benefits, whether that's a sustainability linked loan or smoother operations or happier workforce that is less truant and therefore you're making more. It's all about that triple and quadruple bottom line.
Mark, I need to ask because it's obviously
Yeah.
the right thing to do. All right. No one can disagree that creating a way of sustainably using your resources is obviously good. There's no debating it. But when it comes to practice, we need to look at the two sides. So there's the right thing to do, the moral thing, and then there's the
Yeah.
law. Do you feel like
Yeah.
rules and regulation today are enforcing ESG, or is it too broad of a concept? There's a lot of gray areas, so people don't really have to do it. It's just that they do it for the reputation, but it's not like they're gonna get fined. Because you did mention legal trouble, but
Mhm.
is it enforced at that level?
An excellent question, and one that frankly is incredibly difficult to answer because the answer is it depends. And this is a terrible answer. But it really does depend on the environment that you find yourself in and the region of the world that you find yourself in, and the period of time you find yourself in. Um, I think maybe we'll delve a little bit back into history. But at some point back in, the early 1900s, there were no child labor laws whatsoever. And you had children as young as 6, 7, 10, whatever, working in factories and working their little fingers off and dying in large numbers. And eventually you had regulation that came in and said, well, actually, we're going to introduce a minimum age of employment. And at the time, enforcement wasn't so good. But over time, enforcement strengthened and it became the norm that, hey, we're not going to employ people who are 8 or 12. We're going to have a minimum age of 15. We're going to have a minimum age of 18, of 21, depending on where you are. And then cultural norms kind of take over. But the general idea is that there's progression. So if you look back at early 1900s, you'll see that with child labor. You start to move towards maybe the 1970s, and you'll see that we're starting to see that the environment isn't what it used to be, right? And then you have the EPA coming in, you know, they have a lot of regulation that comes into play, and a lot of companies skirt them. They're not complying. But over time, compliance, sharpens its teeth and starts to bite. It starts to hurt. So I think the simplest answer I can give you is regulation necessary? Yes. Is regulation the same as enforcement? Absolutely not. Regulation has to come in. Enforcement comes in ebbs and flows, but trends towards actual enforcement, which is great. And I think that different regions are experiencing this at different rates. And I think that is not necessarily to say that it's always getting better. Without delving into politics, I think that the focus on ESG has shifted in some regions. You'll find that it's no longer a priority. It's no longer at the top. Um, but on the long run, it's going to get there. It will continue to be there, right? You may lose some interest now, but it's going to come back. That's the trend.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be something you heard about a couple of years ago, but now everyone's talking
Mhm.
about it. So you can't avoid it anymore. That's how I feel. But let me read you this. Redefining
Hit me.
ESG risk management with frictionless AI-powered technology. Break this
Yes.
down to us. How are you
Cool.
integrating AI and how does Metis work? Talk to us about the product.
Yeah, happy to do so. You know how I mentioned earlier that ESG risk management is a complex task? It takes a lot of time. You got to build all these assessments and monitoring systems and whatnot. That makes it expensive, frankly. And that's because you utilize a ton of people. right? If you want to assess a company right now, Antoine, what are you going to do? You're going to ask them for, 50 documents. You're going to read through those documents. You're going to check against your checklist. You're going to figure out which areas they comply with, which ones they don't. You're going to mark them up, and then you're going to figure out what kind of risk that poses. You're going to assign it a score, and then you're going to spit it out. If your client really cares, they're going to tell you, well, how do I make it better? So cool. You sit down, you write out some more guidance, and you issue that out. That kind of process would take someone like me or someone like you, depending on our level of experience. I think you're a smart guy, you'll do it quick. Maybe a day, maybe 2 days, right? Now, think about a supply chain that has 10,000 entities in it, right? Now you have 10,000 man days of work that are required in order to get that assessment across the entire chain. Um, that's just not feasible. It'll be too expensive. It'll be too time consuming. And frankly, I don't think anyone has the appetite to spend 10,000 days doing this. I don't have the appetite to spend 10,000 days doing this, and I like this stuff. And that's where automation and technology really comes in. It enables you to do really awesome things, which is train an AI model to complete that exercise. Train it in such a way that it can reason, that it can understand from context, that it can extrapolate, that it can infer from the information provided to it in such a way that it answers that questionnaire for you, in such a way that it's able to understand the relevant standards that are applicable and then determine whether or not that information meets the standard. And then the next step is, well, how do you get to that standard for it to be able to reason and to produce for you that output? So when we say revolutionizing it through AI powered technology, it's this idea of taking something that would have taken so long, that would have been so complicated, and training a model to do it so well that it really, really does cut delivery time by more than 85%, cuts the cost by more than 90%, and makes it accessible. I think that's the key word here, that it makes it accessible. So it's not just the mega corporations that are doing this for a sample of their portfolio. It becomes that those mega corporations can do it for their entire portfolio, but also smaller companies can now approach this kind of activity, can now start to actually run it within their operations because it's no longer cost prohibitive or time prohibitive. So what Metis does cleverly is it takes this idea of ESG risk management, breaks it down into 5 distinct modules, and then enables you to sort of click through and make all of that happen without the cost, without the time. And I'll delve into each of the modules shortly, I promise.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating, but you talked about you bring up comply again, you talk about the supply chain. So let me ask you this. If I am a company and I am in my supply chain, there is some kind of company that is the worst in terms of ESG. How does that
Yeah,
affect me personally? I mean, if I have
good
no
question.
control over these companies, and in a lot of industries, especially if you go back in the supply chain, it ends up being like two, three companies controlling most of the market. So if
Mhm.
that's not really in your power to change, or the cost of change is too high, how does it affect you? Or do they take into consideration that I would lose a lot of money if I change my supplier?
Okay. Look, there's different ways to answer this question as well. You'll find that I say it depends a lot. Let's take an actual real example. Let's take a look at what kind of company would you like to be? I'm going to make you a book publisher. Congratulations, that's what you are. You're now a publishing agency. Amazing. What's in your supply chain, right? You've at some point got a someone who's providing you with paper, right? Got to have the paper somehow, right? Before it goes into the printing machine, there's got to be paper. Well, where's that paper coming from? Somewhere in their supply chain, there exists a forest of some sort, right? I'm personifying the exists. So the environmental management policies or environmental management approach of your supply chain entity that is giving you that paper should matter to you. Why? Because if they do not have in place appropriate measures that do not protect themselves from environmental disaster, from deforestation within that area, they're going to run out of paper. They run out of paper. You have nothing to print on. You can't sell no books. You're not making any money. Let's take a different social example. Let's say that you are, what would you like to be? You can pick, and I'll find something in the supply chain for you. We can do this live. It'll be fun.
Yeah, I mean, let's say I have, you know what, let's say I have like I have products that I'm shipping from across the ocean and I have to ship them
Okay,
to a carrier. And that
sure.
carrier doesn't use anything electric. It's just all dumping oil and this is what's happening in the back.
Wonderful. You are basically that you're the person doing the shipping. Awesome. Or you're the person directing the shipping. You're not doing the shipping yourself. So somewhere in your supply chain, there sits a company that is actually operating that boat, right?
Mhm.
That's moving your stuff around. They're operating the plane. There are people on those boats. Those people have contracts, right? Perhaps those contracts aren't up to snuff. They're not up to the right level. Perhaps they are working excessive overtime. Perhaps they're not being paid on time. Perhaps they don't have access to medical insurance. So let's say that all those things are happening and that they pose a high social risk, right? They're in a high risk environment and their policies don't protect them. And there's a high risk of something going wrong. Now, something going wrong is a strike. It's people on that boat deciding, well, we are so fed up with our conditions, we are no longer going to work. What does that do? Stops the boat, stops your items from making it across the ocean. So, really, the first thing we're talking about is operational disruption, right? Every business is impacted by its supply chain. It is reliant on its supply chain, and it needs for its supply chain to be as protected as possible, to be as efficient as possible, to ensure that I, the client, don't suffer any operational disruptions. That's sort of the pure business angle to it. But second, do you want to be associated with something in your supply chain that brings you a headache? Let's say you are a company like Boohoo, right? UK fashion retailer. You sell your stuff online, life is good, no problems. And then suddenly someone pops out an article saying that, hey, they found forced labor in your supply chain. What happens? Your investors are unhappy, the public is unhappy. So your sales dwindle, your investors pull out. And in the example of Boohoo, they lose £1 billion of value in 24 hours. So we've talked about operational, reputational comes in and just knocks it out the park with the possibility of how it could impact you. We're really talking here about situations that may not emerge often, but when they do, they hurt, right? They really hurt. There's more. We could probably talk about more. So legally, let's say you're a company like H&M. I'd advise you to take a look at where they're being sued currently, and it's a lot of places. Um, and that disrupts your ability to do business in those countries. It again affects your reputation, but it also makes it so that you spend a ton on legal fees. So you're losing.
You know,
That's the argument here.
Mark, I empathize with a lot of emotional arguments, but they don't affect me. Well, what you just gave me is
Hmm.
a purely business reason why ESG makes a lot of sense. And that for
Yeah.
me was which makes it a great answer. Because,
I'm glad you think so. I'm glad you think so. If you walk
because,
in with a bleeding heart trying to sell ESG, it doesn't work.
yeah,
I'm telling
exactly.
you, it doesn't work.
Exactly. That's why I started the conversation by saying we can all agree that this is good, but it has to make
Hmm.
economic sense. It has to be good for business. I mean, whether we like it or not, people are not going to change unless it's good for business. I mean, there's this other side of it where people are more conscious about where they're buying from, and that's real.
Hmm.
People would be willing to
Yeah.
pay a bit more for a company that is, well, I'm not gonna go as extreme as saying that doesn't use child labor. I'm gonna say
Yeah.
something like maybe respects the environment or uh,
Hmm.
these little things, they affect people. And I myself would be willing to pay slightly more for a company that is really putting sustainability in the heart of how they operate. So it does make sense to me. And there is a
You're part of the solution.
and
You're
there
part
is
of
a
the
great
solution. You're
business
part of what
case.
businesses are hedging for right now. This is what businesses are sort of adjusting to. There's going to be people like you who want to see the appropriate certification on the product that they're using, who want to ensure that the companies that they're dealing with aren't responsible for some terrible things out there. So yeah, kudos to you. I wish we had more like you.
I think it's a cultural shift. I feel like over time, people are really considering this because before it was just about what's the cheapest, what's the most
Mhm.
affordable. Right now, I think the culture has changed. People are more aware. And which brings me to, well, one of my last questions, which is the culture in the region where you're operating. I
Yeah.
feel like this concept of ESG, you've been working at it for a while now, and in the region specifically. But do you feel like they're on par with other regions around the world? Do you feel like it's growing? Where do you position the UAE, the GCC, the Middle East in general in terms of ESG policy and people's understanding of it?
An excellent question, and I think something that I was alluding to earlier, which is that different regions deal with things in different ways, and I think it's also important to make sure that when we talk about the differences within regions, it's not just seen as a cultural thing. Sometimes it's just the stage that you find yourself in, right? A country like the UAE has maybe existed for 45 years, something like that, maybe 50, I'm not sure, 73. So yeah, it's got to be a little bit over that. But you can't sort of judge it by the same yardstick that you would a place that's been around for 1,000 years, right? And I think that in that regard, they're making tremendous strides. I think that the MENA region in particular is really poised to transform, and it has been transforming. I think we've all kind of seen that. But from an ESG perspective in particular, I think that for a long time it escaped a lot of scrutiny. It's not an area that was typically associated with good practices, but I think that's changing from different perspectives. And so, one of the things we talked about earlier was regulation. This is always one of my favorite examples, but the there are eight fundamental conventions that the UN has out there on like human rights, right? And the UAE is a signatory to six of those, and the US is a signatory to just two of those, right? So it really does depend on the angle that you choose to look at things. If you're looking from just a regulatory sign-up perspective, UAE is, killing it out there. Um, but when you look at enforcement, perhaps there's a gap there still. But it's something that, like we said earlier, comes and moves in a certain direction, even if it's ebbing and flowing. And what I can tell you is that having been here for the last 10 years, the conversations that I had on day one are very different from the conversations that I have today. It is no longer about introducing the idea of sustainability. It is no longer about approaching it from that CSR bleeding heart kind of perspective. I think businesses have matured to a degree, not all, but a lot of businesses have. And I think it's actually one thing I'll note is that it's useful to look at businesses as being in three stages. They're either ad hoc, they're developing, or they're leading. Um, I would say that the MENA region was ad hoc for a very long time, moved itself into developing, and now there's quite a few firms out here that really, really are leading. They've understood that this is important, not only to them, but to the international investors, and that they recognize that they're part of this interwoven global system, and that they can't afford to be laggards in that regard. So, to answer your question more succinctly, I'd say that there's still quite a way to go, but that the pace of change here has been quicker than the pace of change that I've seen historically in any other region. And that's something that makes it a really, really exciting place to work.
Mark, I feel like ESG is a lot of people are worried about the how the future is going to change different jobs and industries. I feel like
Mhm.
you're very safe in ESG. I think that because it's just a growing it's a growing topic that I feel eventually will be normalized more than it is today. And I feel like the region you're in is also booming as well. So I see a great potential for where you're going. It's just been a couple of months, but I really wish you the best. And I want to thank you so much for doing this. It was great talking to you.
That's really kind of you, and I appreciate the opportunity. I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. And what I will say is is that I agree with you. I think ESG is a good sector to be in for now. But I'll be even more honest. I hope ESG as a standalone concept disappears, right? For it to truly, truly be successful, it shouldn't be a standalone thing. It should be something that's integrated into our decision making. It's integrated into business. It's integrated into the way that we do things. And that's sort of the hope. And that's part of what Metis tries to do. The idea is for us to find a way to embed these kind of practices into your existing operations in a way that is actually seamless, that fits right in and makes it so that you don't feel like you're doing ESG. You're just optimizing your business. And it happens to be that ESG is, positive ESG is the byproduct of that.
So it's not an add-on, it's a necessity for your business.
It becomes a way of doing things. We're here to optimize. We're just optimizing with a particular view right now, but at the end, we're all getting a better result.
Well, that was a very interesting last second take.
Yeah,
Thanks for that,
I
Mark.
thought I'd throw you a curveball, you know?
Yes, you did. All right. Thank you so much for doing this and wish
A
you the
pleasure,
best.
Anton. Thank you. Thank you. It was nice speaking to you. Take care.